nice to see you all here today for the presentation by Mike Prong of Fern Ridge Eco Landscaping on Fusion Gardening. My name is Barbara Collinson and I'm the D16 Director, and I'm your moderator and chat room guard, I suppose, today. Without further ado, I'd like to give you a little bit of background about Mike. Mike, for over the last 12 years, Mike has been a dedicated, enthusiastic, and forward-thinking advocate for green practices in the landscape industry, as is his entire firm. And if you haven't taken a look at Fern Ridge's website online, just Google Fern Ridge Eco Landscaping and you'll be let in. It's an absolutely terrific website, and it showcases the work that they've been having ongoing for all of these years. Mike has had an interest in landscaping ever since he was a young boy growing up just outside of London in Aylmer, Ontario, which then led to his enrollment in Fanshawe College's landscape design program in the fall of 2009 and his completion of Mohawk College's horticultural apprenticeship program in 2013. With his hands-on industry experience and a broad knowledge of horticulture, Mike can turn even the most basic of landscapes into an eco-friendly oasis. Now, I must admit, Mike, I had to look up what fusion landscaping was. I thought, okay, I've heard of fusion food and I've heard of cold fusion, but I really haven't heard of fusion landscaping. But I must admit, I was very pleased to see that it involves low water, low maintenance, and basically low impact. All of the things that we as gardeners, especially if we have to pay water bills, are trying to embrace. So just a few rules today. Everybody's microphone, except mine right now, is and Mike's, is muted. If you have questions during Mike's talk, it's best if you type them in the chat function. If you're in this session through Zoom, along the bottom of your screen, you'll see chat. It's a little bubble thing. If you click on that, it'll bring up the chat box, and you can move that chat box around the screen. If you're joining us through the feed loop, Amy Vieira, who is our University of Western Ontario techie today, will be throwing them into the Zoom chat box to have them seen after Mike's presentation. Once Mike is finished, and Mike will talk for about 45 minutes, we're going to have 15 minutes of questions, and it will be me that asks the questions out of the chat box. So I think we're ready to go. Mike, if you're ready to go, take it away. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks again for having me. I've been looking forward to this, very excited to be able to speak about fusion gardening. And as Barb alluded to, fusion gardening, it's not so much become a buzzword in the industry yet, but we are trying to get it to that point. And as Barb alluded to with, fusion food and cold fusion, just like anything else, fusion gardening focuses on implementing or combining two different theories or two different ideas into one cohesive type of garden design. So in this aspect, what we're looking at is both drought tolerance and water tolerance, which may seem like conflicting ideas, but it is a really neat way to be able to conserve water, use a lot of native plants, while at the same time reducing maintenance. And I'll be able to give you a little bit of background about how we can do that, a few different ways that we can harvest the rainwater coming from the downspouts or various other areas of the home, whether it be a sump pump or even if you just have a soggy area in your yard. Some of these practices can be implemented quite easily, quite cost effectively, and not a whole lot of labor is required depending on which aspect that you use. So without further ado, we'll get into it here, and I will give a background on what fusion gardening actually is. So basically it's a new and innovative style in gardening that blends the traditional elements, so your typical flowers, pathways, shrubs, perennials, that sort of thing, in with a new sort of trend that reflects the way that we live today. So whether it be affordable, eco-friendly, low maintenance, low water use, all of these things that you keep hearing about on a regular basis that we can take steps to help reduce the effects of climate change. And I don't know about what the weather's like where people are today, but where I am, it's been raining consistently and constantly, so it actually blends in quite well with some of the aspects of fusion gardening. So here's an example of a fusion garden. And at first blush, you'll know sort of, well, that doesn't really look much different than, you know, a traditional sort of English cottage style garden. And that's true. The one of the things that we really strive for is that when it comes to fusion gardening or eco-friendly aspects, they have to look just as good, if not better, than your quote unquote traditional landscape aspects. And that's just because inherently when people hear, you know, eco-friendly or green, they'll think a couple of things. One, things are going to be more expensive. And two, when people hear native or eco-friendly when it comes to gardening, they think, you know, weedy and overwhelming. And that for some garden styles, you know, as English cottage garden might be a little bit overwhelming to some people, but at the same time, we can take even contemporary or modern style landscapes and put a fusion garden spin or a native garden spin on that as well, and incorporate fusion gardening into really any sort of garden design principle. So in this picture here, there's a couple of different things that exemplify fusion gardening and what we really want to emphasize. And one is the patio itself. The stone that's actually been used there is something called a permeable paver, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the future or in the later in the talk here. But what permeable paving is it's a interlock paver or surface designed to allow water to permeate through rather than hit and run off. As I'm sure you've heard, especially in Europe right now, there's huge issues with flooding. You know, every time we seem to get a big rain, parts of the GTA, whether it be downtown in the beaches areas or now even in, you know, Burlington, Oakville area where I am, there's been significant flooding the bigger that storms get. So permeable paving is one way to manage that storm water, as well as a couple different aspects as well, or ways that we can harvest that water. So why fusion gardening to begin with? Well, as I alluded to, it helps to reduce the risk of flooding by collecting and capturing water that falls on a property. So our goal is any water that is ejected from a downspout or a sump pump or, you know, runoff from a driveway, as much of that water that can be captured and kept on site and kept out of the municipal stormwater systems, the better. When you look at our infrastructure and how it was originally designed, it was not designed for, you know, thousands of homes to be, you know, capturing water and funneling it into these infrastructure systems. And, you know, to a point, stormwater management ponds and things like that, they help, but everything has its capacities. So if everyone takes this small scale idea and, you know, if you implement it, the sort of the sum of all its parts are going to make a huge difference. So just inherently through the use of the fusion gardening, it does a couple other things. It increases biodiversity just because we're using a lot of native plants. And we'll get into why we use native plants a little bit more when we talk about rain gardens and bioretention gardens. The way that they're designed, they're inherently low maintenance and they're not a whole lot of upkeep. We actually have a fusion garden at our office headquarters, and I think that just because we've been so busy, I've spent maybe 4 to 5 hours this year being in there and weeding and upkeep, and that's really just because I like doing it. It wasn't even really necessary. But there was just some puttering that needed to be done. But other than that, it is pretty self-reliant when it comes to the maintenance. And then inherently, when using native plants, and like I said, we'll get into it a little bit further, why they are so good at you know, conserving water and why they are so drought tolerant. And then when it comes to cost, fusion gardening, if done correctly, is quite comparable to, again, when I say the traditional style of landscaping, that's, you know, the typical creation of the plant beds and planting of the perennials and shrubs and things like that. So really everything, like I said, starts at collecting the water, or how we manage the water itself. So depending on where you live, you may see your downspout run like this. So what that is, it's basically going into a pipe and going directly into a storm sewer where the water is collected with all of the other houses that is collected to the storm sewer, and all that water is pushed to an area where it would be ejected, whether it be into a stream or a stormwater management pond or a ditch or what have you. So what fusion gardening aims to do is basically disconnecting this downspout and rerouting that water to an area where it can be collected and captured on the property and managed in a way that it's allowed to infiltrate into the ground, dissipate into the atmosphere, be soaked up by plants, where any extra would be evapotranspirated or basically sweated out through the leaves of the plants. So basically what we're doing is we're consolidating that water in an area where it can be safely put back into the water table or into the atmosphere without worrying about issues of affecting the house foundation or other areas that water generally you may not want it to collect. So we're pushing it to an area where it can safely be collected and dispersed back into the natural sort of cycle of things. So as you can see at the bottom there, many municipalities, especially in the GTA, because of the presence of flooding, are making this step mandatory. So we're seeing a real boost in people looking for ways to manage that water, as opposed to having it just eject out of the downspout right at their foundation. So there are a few ways to do that. So this is what we're going to talk about today. So these are a few photos of some projects that we've done in the past. On the left-hand side there's actually what we call a rain garden hidden in the photo here. And can you guys see my mouse cursor? I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not. No? Okay, so on the left-hand side in the photo, there is just on the other side of the hostas there's actually a rain garden, and we'll get into what a rain garden is in a little bit here. Obviously, at the top in the middle, there's a rain barrel, which is a quite practical and efficient way to capture rainwater to be used as a water source in other areas of landscape. And then in the bottom, we have a river rock drainage swale there, which is a great way to convey water and move it from one area to another. So we'll start with rain barrels, like I said, which is a pretty straightforward and rudimentary way to capture the rainwater. You're basically putting a bucket at the source, and that allows you to use that water at a later time, whether it be for watering areas of the garden. That's the most common way, just to fill it up with a watering can and spot water. However, now there are a lot of systems that can be actually hooked up right to the rain barrel itself. And there's actually, I imagine that a lot of people are familiar with Lee Valley in this group. And if you're not familiar with Lee Valley, you should be, because it's fantastic for gardeners, and they have everything under the sun that you could possibly want. It seems like, anyway. But they have great little solar systems that you can actually hook up right to your rain barrel and create nice little drip irrigation systems, and they're great for vegetable planters or raised planters. Yeah, you're just using that harvested water, which otherwise would just naturally flow off into the ground. So rain barrels are relatively, self-explanatory. There's not a whole lot of explanation that needs to go into those, except for the fact that they do work great, and they are incredibly low maintenance. Aside from just making sure that they're empty in the winter, our climate isn't so kind to the plastic rain barrels. If there's water left sitting in them, they'll freeze and eventually end up cracking. But as long as you empty them before the winter, they're a fantastic resource to be able to capture that water and use it in an easy and cost-effective way. There's many sizes available, many styles, which is fantastic. Conservation authorities or municipalities actually sometimes will actually just give them away. They're anything from, the typical sort of industrial looking gray just straight barrels, which is, just a simple water capturing system, to actually something that is a little bit more ornate that can be tied into the landscape and actually be a feature, as opposed to, just sort of a big drum on the corner of a house. So because they were getting a little bit more popular, and the downspout disconnection is becoming a little bit more, or is becoming mandatory in a few more spots, people have, obviously, as companies do, will take advantage of that and give a few more options in terms of aesthetics and sizes and things like that. So the next way is what's called a French drain, or Soakaway pit. So what a French drain is basically just a hole in the ground filled with gravel, and it's a spot where water can be collected and allowed to infiltrate into the ground. It's sort of an out of sight, out of mind solution, where, as you can see in the photo on the left-hand side here, this is sort of a prefabricated French drain, which is dug in just below the surface of the lawn, or whatever the runoff surface is at the ejection point of the downspout. So that grate would, drainage grate would set right at the same level as the lawn in this case, and as the water is ejected from the downspout, it would fill that subterranean cistern, and then that pipe, it would be directed, whether it be to a secondary collection feature, whether it be a rain garden or drainage swale, or if it just directs to an area where the water can be ejected in a safer way, away from the house foundation. So this is a great solution for tight spaces where you want to collect the water, and you just basically run a pipe, whether it be along the foundation of the house. If you don't have a whole lot of space there to get the water, you can collect it and move it to a spot where it can be a little bit more readily contained and infiltrated into the ground. So like I said, on the left here, that's a little bit more of a prefabricated one, whereas the one on the right is literally just a hole dug into the ground, lined with landscape or cloth or landscape fabric, and then filled with clear gravel. So what a clear gravel is, it doesn't have any sand or dusty material in it. So a common material used to fill in the French drain or Soakaway pit is 3/4 inch clear gravel. So all of the material in 3/4 inch clear gravel is 3/4 inches wide, and it's all just the 3/4 inch gravel. There's no sand or dusty material which would clog up the pores and affect the drainage rate. So the less sediment or dusty material, the better. It allows the water to drain through the gravel a little bit better there. And so, like I said, what that does is it gives the water a spot to collect below ground where it's not going to be a soppy, wet mess, and in an area where space constraints might be a little bit more of a concern. So this basically goes through most of what I was just mentioning here. The size of the drain and the pit will ultimately depend on the location, the type of soil, the infiltration rate of the soil. So if you're dealing with a sandy soil where the water is going to drain through a little bit quicker, the Soakaway pit doesn't have to be quite as big because the water isn't going to be held in there quite as long. If the soil around the Soakaway pit is a heavy clay or is a little bit more dense, you're going to want to make that Soakaway pit a little bit bigger because the water is going to have a hard time soaking into the ground. So you're going to want to have a bigger area for water to collect because it's inherently going to stay in there a little bit longer as it drains through the clay. So as I mentioned, it's a little bit less of an ornamental solution and more of a functional solution, just because most of the actual infrastructure is underground. So you don't see a lot of it. So this is more, I would implement this if, there is a wet area close to the foundation of a house and the water just needs to be moved away. Not necessarily a lot of area for garden or a rain barrel or a swale. So this is basically just typically a pure drainage solution as opposed to an aesthetic or an aesthetic/functional solution. So in terms of an aesthetic/functional solution, One of the common elements that I like to employ for conveying water from one area to the other is something called a dry creek or a drainage swale. So as this name suggests, it's basically just a dish-shaped swale, and its just main function is to move water from one area to another. So on the photo on the left-hand side here, there was a natural swale that ran through a backyard, as you'll find in a lot of municipalities where houses are built in a sort of neighborhood fashion where the drainage isn't necessarily the greatest. So what they'll do is they'll create a sort of man-made swale that runs through multiple properties. So what happens if one person affects that swale, somebody unfortunately on the other side of that is going to be left with a backup of water if that drainage gets blocked. So this is a fantastic way to keep that drainage path open and allow that water to move from one side of the property to the other without sacrificing aesthetic or beauty. So in the instance on the left-hand side photo, basically the water is coming in from the property on the far side of the fence there, and the water is just naturally wanting to run through the drainage course that runs through the back property. So we, instead of trying to redirect that water, to the back of the property where it would be allowed to, soak in and create sort of a wet mess along the back fence, we've actually just found out where that water naturally wants to go, accentuated that, and actually used that rather than fighting against Mother Nature, show where the water wants to go and design around that. So we found where the natural water path was, excavated out sort of this dish shape, as you can see in the swale in both those photos. And what that does is that it increases the holding capacity of the swale itself. If we create a dish shape, the water is allowed to naturally sort of run through there. And what the river rock does is it slows the pace of the water as it's running through there to allow it to allow the water to infiltrate a little bit more readily along the path. So rather than all of the water just rushing through the swale and then getting to the end, we're trying to infiltrate as much water along that creek course as we can as it's being conveyed through the yard. So on the picture on the right hand side, what we've done is there's actually a downspout at the front corner of the house, just behind that tree there, and the water is conveyed through the front yard, and then at the front corner of the property up closer to the sidewalk, there's actually a collection garden planted with a bunch of native species that preferred the area both drought, the species are both drought tolerant and moisture tolerant, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but we'll get into some plants that are both fantastic for super dry and super wet areas in a little bit here. So as far as the creek swales are concerned, the best way to convey water, in my opinion, just because anytime that you can keep water on the surface, it's much easier to, one, see where the water is flowing, and two, if there are any issues, to fix them. If we go back to the French drain or the Soakaway pit, that pipe that runs from that below ground cistern or that below ground reservoir, if that ends up getting clogged or cracked, that's very difficult to notice, for one, and once that issue is noticed, to fix it is a pain as well, as you have to dig up the area and try and replace the pipe or diagnose the issue. You have to basically dig up the feature. So with the dry creek swale, because it is on the surface, you can see exactly where the water is running, how it's running, and because you have a point A where you know the water is going into the swale, and you have a point B of where you know the water is supposed to go, as long as the water is getting from point A to point B, you know that the swale is doing what it wants to do. And if the water isn't getting from point A to point B, it's very easy to see where it is getting lost along the way, and it's quite easy to alter the dry creek beds to ensure that the water is getting where you want. They are obviously a more ornamental solution than the Soakaway pit or the French drain, and they can be planted with tolerant plantings to help increase that water holding capacity as the water moves along through the swale. So things like native grasses like switchgrasses or big blue stem, plants like daylilies, oddly enough, are fantastic. Ferns are great. Blue flag iris is good as well. And there's a few more plantings that we'll get into with the rain gardens here. So this is definitely my favorite my favorite way to capture and collect water, and that's mainly because it's a blend of what I like to again call the traditional garden aspect with the low impact aspect of fusion gardening here. So really on the left-hand side, it exemplifies really visually exactly how a rain garden works. So when I talk about a traditional garden, you know, people will generally remove the lawn and the or whatever organic matter is there if they're creating a garden in an area where lawn is typically or where lawn already exists. They take off the sod, they build up with some fresh triple mix soil, do the planting, and then add mulch on top. So where that differs from a rain garden, instead of building up, what we're doing is we're actually digging down. And the further we dig down, the more water we can collect. So as you can see, there is basically a dish shape on the picture on the left-hand side. And the deeper the dish, the more holding capacity that you have, and the wider the dish, also the more holding capacity that you have. So the size of your rain garden is ultimately going to be dictated on the amount of water that you want to capture. If you're just capturing water from one downspout, your rain garden can be, you know, even anywhere from 5 to 6 feet by 5 to 6 feet. It doesn't have to be absolutely huge. If you have a sandy soil or a loamy soil, you can have even less square footage because your water is going to drain through a little bit faster. Very similarly to the Soakaway pit, if you have a clay base or a heavy clay soil, that water is going to take a little bit longer to dissipate. So you're going to want to have a little bit of a larger rain garden. To that end too, if you are digging in clay, obviously if you ever have dug in clay before, you know, it's a little bit harder to dig into than sandy or loamy soil. So one way that you can sort of alleviate a little bit of that labor is that if you can't make the rain garden as deep as you'd want, you can extend the overall footprint of it. So if you're going to make the rain garden shallower, you just make it wider. If you are in a little bit more of a space, if your space is a little bit more constrained, you can make that rain garden narrower, but make it deeper. If you're just thinking about volume, you know, if you have a Tupperware container, something that's long and skinny is going to hold something about the same as something that's narrow and deep. So it's very similar when it comes to a rain garden. And there are a lot of calculators and tools online actually that will allow you to put in the, you know, the square footage that you're looking to capture from the roof, and they actually allow you to put in sort of Google Earth images, and you can measure out the area of your roof that is going to be draining to one downspout, and you can figure out exactly how big you need to make your rain garden, which is really cool. And then in terms of the actual creation of the rain garden, it's actually quite easy. Once you have the dish shape, what I like to do is actually create berms on the outside of the rain garden area, and that actually increases the holding capacity as well. So if you don't want to dig out quite as deep, you can take the material that you do dig out, add it to the outside, and that basically doubles your depth without digging twice as deep. So it's a great way to reuse some material as well. If disposal is an issue, you can reuse some of that material to build up around the outsides and increase your holding capacity a little bit. So again, most of the creation of the garden area itself is very similar to a traditional garden in the planting and the plant species that are chosen, but it's a little bit different in terms of the actual construction process. So features heavy uses of native plants, which we're going to get into after the description of the rain gardens here, and it's definitely by far the most ornamental. Any rain garden that I've done, what I strive for is that it shouldn't look like a solution to a problem that you're having. If the area of the garden or of the landscape is a soaking wet mess, there are ways to build that area into the garden or into the landscape by using a rain garden that can actually match the various other areas of the landscape. So rather than having you know, a full perennial garden and then having an area that's wet and you know, that might look neglected, you can actually use a surprising number of species that would be used in a normal traditional garden would actually be quite relevant in the rain garden infusion elements as well. So if a rain garden is properly designed, one comment that I get frequently is what happens to the water that is collected in the rain garden itself. Is it going to attract mosquitoes? Is it going to, you know, be sitting there for a long period of time? And because we are capturing and collecting that water in a variety of different ways, like I mentioned, we're looking to infiltrate the water. We're looking to have the plants soak up the water. We're looking for the water to be evaporated back into the atmosphere. So rather than just waiting for the water to seep back into the ground, we're adding a few different elements that are aiding in that elimination of water, or that disbursement of water into the landscape. So as I mentioned, rain gardens can be anything from large scale to small scale. So this are two projects that we did, actually both in Mississauga. So the one on the left-hand side is actually at the IMAX headquarters in Mississauga. And what they did is that they had a very large parking lot area. And rather than just basically having an area where the water is all just shed away to, which is typical. And this area in between the parking lot was basically a ditch that would just fill up with water, and it would become an unmaintainable mess, basically. So Fern Ridge and a water engineering company called Aquifer Beach, which is located in Mississauga, came up with this plan to figure out exactly how much water was coming off of that parking lot, how much water needed to be harvested, and how that could all basically work together within a fusion garden aspect or a low impact aspect. So what we did is we came up with this harvesting system. It's tough to see in this photo here, but on the left-hand picture at the end of the swale, you'll see sort of an inlet or just like a black box almost, it looks like in this picture. So all of the water actually is harvested through a drain that's located right there. And the water is actually funneled into the swale, and all of those plants that are in there, there's a multitude of different both native plants and non-native plants that have been employed to actually soak up that water. And one thing that we have to take into account when dealing with any runoff from parking lots or roadways are salt, chemicals, pollution, and things like that. And plantings are actually fantastic filters of many of those different things. So in addition to just getting rid of the water, we're actually helping to clean the water before it goes into a natural area, which is located just on the backside of the property here. So on the right-hand picture, it says what's called a bioretention cell. So something very similar is this is located on Elm Drive in Mississauga. And on either side of this boulevard, there are two parking lots which are sloped towards this grassy area. And very similarly to what happened at the IMAX headquarters is that this boulevard basically became a sopping wet mess. It wouldn't be able to be mowed or maintained until June or July if they were lucky. Is about as soon as it would dry out after the spring. And then once it rained, it would just be inherently wet for days afterwards as well. So what we did here was we created this, there was this existing reservoir which was poorly maintained and not upkept at all. It was all dilapidated. So So we went in and cleaned it all out and planted this bioretention cell. So what a bioretention cell is basically it's a large scale rain garden. So we fed the bioretention cell with drainage pipes, which are connected to the runoff drains from the parking lot, and all of that water is collected into these bioretention cells, where it's planted with a variety of different plants that again can soak up the water, clean it, and filter it before it gets into the municipal storm system. So that's a large scale example, but obviously for homeowners, something of this magnitude isn't going to work very well. So the great thing about rain gardens is that they can actually be modified to, like I said, almost any size. So the picture on the left-hand side here is a property in Milton, and it backs onto a park area. So rather than just having the typical runoff from a residential area, they actually have a full soccer field, which is coming to their backyard. So they have their property, which slopes to the back fence, and then the soccer field, which also slopes to the back fence. And then right behind that dogwood in the corner, there's actually a municipal storm drain. So everything ran right to that drain, and anything that the drain couldn't capture, basically they had a huge pond in that back corner of the yard, which would get up to the height of the roots of that tree there. So what we did was, along the back fence, we, again, rather than building up and trying to push the water and keep it out of the property, we actually created an area where that water can be collected. And if you look at the different colors in the mulch there, that's actually one of the ways that rain gardens are so effective at absorbing water, is we use a little bit of a different type of mulch. So rather than using a wood chip or a bark type mulch, this is called a shredded mulch. So we typically like to use the shredded pine mulch, and what it does is, rather than floating away like wood chips naturally would when exposed to periods of standing water, the shredded mulch actually mats and almost acts like a sponge. And the amount of water that can be captured in that mulch is absolutely amazing. So that is really a huge way that a lot of the water is initially collected. So it soaks it all up, and the mulch holds it. And then over time, it'll evaporate, and it will be slowly released back into the ground, as opposed to having this massive amount of water that is trying to consistently soak in. If you have something to absorb that water and allow it to slowly release, it's a much more effective way of dispersing that water than just waiting for it to all drain into the storm drain over time. So that's what the differentiation is in color there in those pictures. So on the right hand side, you can see that the client has a deck, and then between the deck and the fence, there's not a whole lot of area. It was an unusable area. They didn't, not usable for anything really. So the only reason that they kept it is just for the municipal setback for the construction bylaws. So inherently, because that area is unusable, it became sort of a weedy area. Not a whole lot grew in there because they had the downspout from their house run to the back of the property to get past the deck. So what we did is we created a sort of a hybrid. Between the deck and the fence, there's actually a river rock swale. So that's conveying the water from the downspout past the deck into this rain garden area. So this rain garden is only maybe about 6 feet by 5 feet, so it's not huge, and that's only because it's a relatively sandy soil in this area, so we didn't need a huge footprint, and we were only collecting one downspout. So when we did the calculations, we figured that we needed a rain garden footprint of about 40 square feet or so. Having the swale, which captures a decent amount, and then having the rain garden that allows us to downsize that rain garden, just because it's a relatively small backyard and we had those space constraints to deal with. So now we get into the fun part, which is in my opinion, the plants which go into the rain garden. So as I've mentioned all along, we use a lot of native plantings, and what really sets fusion gardening apart from the traditional gardening is that the plant material that's incorporated into the fusion gardening is both moisture tolerant and drought tolerant. And like I said, that may sound like counterintuitive ideas, but if you think about it, plants that are drought tolerant are going to have extensive root systems, and plants that have extensive root systems are naturally going to be able to deal with periods of a little bit more, little bit hotter weather, a little bit more dry weather. But as long as they have those capabilities to withstand the wetness as well, we skipped ahead there, then they are fantastic for fusion gardens, because they're going to experience periods of extreme wetness like we're dealing with today, but the way with climate change, we're also going longer periods between storms as well. So while they have to deal with the rain and the wetness that they normally experience, they actually have to deal with a lot of drought as well. So the plants that we're going to go through here are fantastic for both of those things, just because they have a deep, dense root system, but at the same time, they can withstand those periods of moisture as well. So on the left-hand side, we've got marsh marigold, which is great. It's got yellow flowers in the spring. The leaves are actually edible. You can cook them like spinach. They're great for overly moist areas, and they actually go dormant in the later season. So they are good to be able to pair with some later season perennials to give some texture and color. In the middle, we've got prairie smoke, which I love for its ferny foliage and its fantastic seed heads, which are displayed in the photo there. Another name for this plant is actually called Grandpa's Whiskers, which is I find quite funny, and that comes from the look of the seed heads. Once they get all fluffy, they actually resemble sort of Grandpa after he hadn't been able to shave during the pandemic, I guess. So the third one there is a plant called threadleaf blue star. It's fantastic for both texture and, as you'll see in a couple slides, for fall color as well. It gets to about 2 to 3 feet tall and has really, really dainty blue flowers in the spring. On the right-hand side, we've got common 9-bark. The picture there is actually of a cultivar called Amber Jubilee. Some people are quite purists when it comes to using native plants. I'm of the belief that anything that satisfies an ecological or biodiverse or functional niche, as long as it's not invasive, is okay. And that comes more from being a landscape designer. And if we're going to have people buy into these ecological ideas, we need to make sure that things are looking as good as quote unquote, again, traditional landscaping. So incorporating cultivars or varieties of plants that have a little bit more of an aesthetic punch over their native cousins, I'm okay with that, as long, like I said, as there's that ecological niche that gets filled. In the summer, some common natives, which I love, purple coneflower, which is quite common. Blazing star, which I'm seeing more and more, which is fantastic, is an absolute bee and butterfly magnet. Butterfly weed, again, sort of self-explanatory, fantastic. There's actually a lot of different Asclepiases, which are great for rain gardens and fusion gardening. Common milkweed is a great drought-tolerant plant. Swamp milkweed is good in the more moist areas. Butterfly weed is great in the drought-tolerant areas. The plant on the far right there is one called swamp mallow, and that's actually a native plant as well, as hard as that is to believe by looking at that flower. That flower is actually about as big as my head. They get about 1 foot to 15 inches across, and there's everything from white to this pale pink to deep scarlet red, and the leaves on them, there's some cultivars that have burgundy leaves, so a great textural interest and a really good talking point in the garden as well. It's a little bit more of an obscure plant, but becoming more and more common as well, just given its aesthetic value. In the fall, on the end there, that's not Colonia Leonia, that's the threadleaf blue star again, and that's added in there to show that some plants have multiple seasons of interest. So if we go back to the spring plants, we see the Amsonia hubrichti. That's what it looks like when it comes out in the spring. And then we've got the fire red, the golden color of the Amsonia in the fall as well, which is fantastic. So in terms of the color palette, this is why I prefer using cultivars. It allows you to give some striking combinations throughout the season as well. Some of the cultivars have a little bit more inherent aesthetic value than, like I said, they're straight species cousins, and this here is an example of that. So we've got a plant called Blood Brothers Switchgrass. We've got a plant called New England Aster, and there are a wide variety of cultivars of those as well. A whole bunch of different colors, heights, growing habits. So a lot of great different colors to incorporate in there. And then as well, we've got the red chokeberry, which is a great shrub, which comes out with dainty little white flowers in the spring. It's got blackberries, which are fantastic for birds in the summer, and then it's got blazing red fall color as well. So in terms of the plantings, that's great, and it gives you a nice spring to summer to fall transition, just mixed in with these few plantings there. So the name of the game is to make sure that plants are able to tolerate that period of extreme moisture in the spring or during periods of heavy precipitation, while also being able to focus on drought tolerance as well. So we're running a little bit tight, so I'm gonna just focus on permeable paving here real quickly. As I mentioned earlier, what permeable paving strives to do is basically infiltrate any water that falls on a hard surface, as opposed to letting it run off into storm sewers. So this is a product on the top called EcoRaster, and it's a grid system that you may have seen before, which is actually in this case, what we've done is we've actually filled it with white clover. So any water that actually falls on the grid system is actually allowed to fall right through. And because we are capturing the water in the driveway itself, that allows us to actually vegetate the driveway. And in this instance, like I said, we've used white clover, and then the EcoRaster comes with an additional modular insert, which is what you see, these concrete blocks. So the grid itself is made from plastic, and it's got drainage holes in the middle, which allows the water to flow through. And then the concrete inserts are what give you the stability to allow you to drive on the area. In the photo on the bottom right-hand side here, this is also the EcoRaster, butted up against a permeable paving interlock patio. So both of these surfaces actually allow water to drain through them as opposed to run off. So again, when incorporating fusion landscaping, it's reducing that runoff in whatever way we can, whether it's water directed towards a garden that's allowed to infiltrate over time, or if that water is actually infiltrated right from the surface itself. So it's a little bit more expensive initially, but ultimately, because it's a little bit more friendly to our climate, because water is allowed to drain in as opposed to sit on the surface. You're not having to use salt, you're not having to use de-icers or things like that, which inherently will break down things like asphalt or concrete. So because that water is allowed to drain through, we're going to have a little bit less degradation from that as well. And many manufacturers now are actually making permeable products. So if you're looking to implement a patio or a seating area, it would be great to actually look to see if permeable paving is an alternative that might work in your area as well. So I think we're good there. I want to make sure that we can get to the questions. So I'll throw it back to Barb for now, and then yeah, we'll answer some questions and we'll go from there.
Thanks very much, Mike. We've got a few questions in the chat right now. And the first question is from Kathy Dyer. Is there any cover that you would recommend over a French drain pit to catch sand or soil or the stuff off your roof or anything like that? Would it be sod? Would it be filter fabric? What would it be?
Yeah, so what we'll generally do is once we have filled the French drain, we will actually wrap it with filter fabric. So rather than just having the gravel exposed or on the top, we'll wrap it with filter fabric, and then even to help further, you can actually sod over that as well. So that's fantastic, and it actually creates a sediment layer or a barrier to keep that clear gravel from getting clogged up. So that's great. That's great.
And I guess you could put beach pebbles on that instead of the sod as well. The second question is from Sally Hussein. She says, can you convert a French drain into a rain garden, or can you direct it to that?
Absolutely. So what we've actually done in the past is we've actually incorporated multiple fusion aspects. So if you have an area which is relatively tight, but you want a rain garden or a drainage garden, but you don't feel that your rain garden is going to be sufficient enough, what we've actually done in the past is we've created a rain garden on top of a French drain. So we'll have the water directed to the rain garden, and once it fills up and captures all it can, any extra is then directed below ground into the French drain. So it basically acts as a below ground overflow. So as long as you have that barrier keeping things from flowing from the rain garden into the clear gravel, into the Soakaway pit, then absolutely. So combining one or more of these aspects is definitely doable for sure.
Thank you. And this is a question from Kathy Dyer. Since we're losing our wetlands, can you create new wetlands to filter sand and pollution and plant them with something like bulrushes or something?
Yeah, and it really comes down to how much water you're dealing with. If you have an area that that would be consistently moist, that's what would be needed for bulrushes. If you don't have an area that is consistently moist, then you'd have to look at more of along the lines of the native plants, which I was mentioning before, which can take periods of extreme moisture, but can also withstand those periods that dry out. So bulrushes or cattails would suffer a little bit if things dried out for an extended period of time. But if the area is a little bit more moist, then absolutely. And it becomes a space thing as well. Obviously, wetlands need a little bit more space in order to be viable. But if the space is there, then absolutely that's something that can be done for sure.
Okay, I have a question here from Doreen Coyne. She says that if an area is always wet but not standing water, can you just plant these plants, these rain garden plants there, and add a good amount of mulch to act as a rain garden?
Yeah, absolutely. What I would recommend, it's always great to sort of create that dish shape just in order to consolidate that water where you want. But after that, if you've just got an area that's naturally moist, for sure, planting the areas and using that good layer, again, you're going to want to make sure that that mulch is shredded mulch. If you just add the normal bark mulch or cedar mulch chips, it's just going to float away and not really do much. As long as you're using shredded mulch, you'll be amazed about how much that can actually absorb and soak up. And then if you're using the plantings, then that will soak up a good amount of water as well. So that's what I like to say. If the area is already soggy, then you're already halfway there. You've already got the rain garden. You know that it's going to be a good spot for it. So, and you're not going to have to really work to get water to that area. It's already there. So as long as you're able to, reshape it a little bit and add in the plants and the mulch, then you should be good to go. Sounds like a good spot.
Good. Sherry asks, could you outline a cement driveway with permeable pavers to work with water runoff? So in other words, to mitigate some of the water runoff. And what needs to be under the permeable pavers? What kind of substrate are we talking about?
Yeah, so that's fantastic. Actually, that's one thing that we do quite commonly as a cost-effective way. So if somebody's looking to reduce the runoff from their driveway but can't afford to redo it all as permeable, what we will actually do, and we've done this quite often with asphalt driveways, is we'll just create a border and maybe some drainage strips that run horizontally from along the width of the driveway, and it basically creates spillways. So as the water's running off, it hits a permeable strip and the water goes in there, and then So you're creating almost quadrants where that water can soak in. So to answer the water about the substrate, you're going to want to make sure that it's clear gravel again. So for a driveway, rather than using like crushed 3/4 crush or limestone screenings, we recommend using again the 3/4 clear gravel topped with something called HPB, which stands for high performance base, and it's basically just a smaller version of 3/4 clear. So instead of 3/4, it's 3/8, and again, it doesn't have that sandy dust like material like limestone screenings does, so it allows the water to drain through really well. So if you're creating those strips, then that water is going to be allowed to infiltrate every so often. And the more drainage strips you have, the easier the water will infiltrate. So yeah, absolutely, that will work.
Okay, I know that's our note to quit, but we've got just a couple more questions if you can answer them real quickly.
Yeah.
Is permeable driveway a DIY project?
It Probably not. I would recommend it at least talking to somebody. The eco raster that I was mentioning is definitely probably closer to DIY just because it doesn't require quite as much excavation. And that's only because the way that the grid is designed. But
okay.
Yeah.
Do you get weeds with it, with a permeable driveway?
Not if it's designed correctly, you won't. No.
Okay. If you have a question for Veronica, they've been considering driveway grids, but they've got a mature tree that has roots that go under the current driveway. So how deep are you going to interfere with this, with the tree roots?
With the eco raster, the thing that makes it great is the way that the grid is designed is that it's designed to disperse weight loads laterally. So what that means is that you don't need as an extensive base layer beneath the driveway. So if you have tree roots, and because the grid is allowing the water to drain through, I actually think that the grid is a good product for above tree roots, just because it's a little bit more malleable, I guess, so to speak, and it allows the water to drain through and reduces the compaction on the tree roots as well, as opposed to the asphalt.
Veronica also wants to know what's the price range on average for permeable driveway systems. If asphalt is $1,000 for a driveway, for example, where would permeable driveways be? 2,000, 3,000, 4,000?
The eco raster is usually about 2 to 3 times as much, but it's also got a 25-year warranty, and if it's done correctly, it'll never have to be replaced. So it's a little bit of a higher initial cost, but it pays for itself over time. Okay,
and one last question that I have quickly. What's the best book that you can think of for homeowners for DIY rain gardens?
Yeah, so anything, there's actually one called Front Yard Garden Ideas by Tara Nolan. And Tara Nolan is fantastic. And actually a few of these photos that were in this speech here are included in that book as well.
Okay, and I have another one, which is the Blue Thumb Guide to Rain Gardens, which we used on our own personal one.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of great resources from local conservation authorities. Credit Valley Conservation has a great one. Toronto Region Conservation has one. Lake Simcoe has one.
Yeah.
So if there's a lot of great resources for rain garden creation. So if you go to Google, you'll have a wealth of knowledge, and if you're going through a conservation authority, that information is going to be nice and accurate and up to date for you.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I just like on behalf of everybody who came today, I'd like to thank you, Mike, for this really terrific presentation. I know most of us will be going home and looking at our garden with a critical eye and saying, okay, what can we do now? That's what I want to do. And I'm sure that there will be a lot of couples who go, well, what can we do now? Which yes. will be a very special discussion, as in it's going to take a lot of work. But thank you so much, and have a great afternoon and a great evening, Mike. Bye-bye.
No problem. See ya. Thank you very much. I don't know, do we just leave now?
Yes, you just leave the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Okay, yes,
appreciate it.
thanks everybody. It was fantastic. I appreciate it. And if you have any questions, by all means, you can reach out to the contact info through the website here.